Hello, Legionnaires, and welcome to some Rando RPG livestream. Tonight, our panel of Dungeon Masters, Game Masters, referees, storytellers, and players will share their diverse tabletop role-playing game experiences to provide ideas, suggestions, and possibly even some advice for your tabletop RPG sessions. Let's get started. Thank you all for joining me on some Rando RPG live stream. I am John Maxley Aushlow, your favorite. No, that's RPG Digest one. I'm actually reading a script and I just screwed it up. And that's awesome. Your facilitator and host for tonight's discussion on exploring the OSR. Now, before I introduce the panelists and start the discussion, let's knock out the announcements. First and foremost, I am truly grateful that you are joining us for tonight's live stream discussion, or VOD if you're watching at a later date, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. After the live stream ends, the full stream remains available for YouTube members only, while the first 4 segments will be chopped into a video for the public to view a month from now. By the way, be sure to subscribe. All of their channels are all in the description right now. Be sure to subscribe. I can't talk to each and every one of them. They deserve it. So what do you do here? Well, in segments 1 through 4, we discuss topics surrounding tabletop role-playing game hobby with an emphasis on individual experiences, desires, and expectations. In tonight's 4 segments on exploring the OSR, we hope to provide ideas, suggestions, and food for thought for your tabletop RPG sessions. And segment 5, maybe you call it post-stream, I don't know. We let down our hair and just talk about nerd issues of interest. If you think you have some presence and charisma, the ability to infotain, edutain, a good AV setup free from noise pollution, and an interest in discussing tabletop RPGs in this format, join Some Rando RPG livestream Discord. Link is in the description to stay tuned for future topics. Help us get to know you. Maybe, just maybe, we'll get you on the show to talk about your experiences as well. Please consider supporting a Legion of Myth through the links in live stream's description. YouTube takes 30%, Twitch takes 50. We don't really have too many viewers on Twitch anymore, thank God. But of your hard-earned money, while Rumble, PayPal, Streamlabs, and Ko-Fi take between 0 and 5% of your donation. As always, Rumble rants and super chats of less than $20 I will read at the end of each segment. $20 or more, I will interrupt these weirdos. No, I won't. I'll interrupt at the earliest convenient as soon as I can. And $50 or more, I will take a drink in your name, and you can force the panel to ask any tabletop RPG related question of your choice right then and there. Now, we didn't make $100 on the last stream talking about what were we talking about last week? Horde Wars. So the pot is still at $175. But if we make $100 or more in super chats or Rumble rants, there will be a $175 giveaway to Drive Through RPG or Palladium Books. And we'll do that during segment 5. YouTube members, as well as tonight's super chatters and Rumble ranters, have the opportunity to win, but you must be watching at the time of the giveaway, else it rolls over to the next week. Don't forget, Legion of Myth moderators will time out or even ban any people who attack any panelist or chatter. Attack the argument, not the person. Keep your various social medias beefs off my show. Apparently, that's the wrong link down there, so don't actually read that link. Go to the description. But the charity we support is the Wounded Warrior Project, a national nonpartisan organization whose mission is to honor and empower wounded warriors. Please refer to the live stream's description. Cat, calm down. I'm reading. Please refer to the live stream's description for the link to where you can make your hopefully tax-deductible donation. And please like this video and subscribe to all of the panelists found in the description. Thank you for your time and support. Whew. Now, all that out of the way, let's meet our panel for tonight. Let's start at the top there with Sean. Who are you? What content or products do you create? And what is your tabletop RPG experience?
Oh, my name is Sean. I'm the creator of Mage's Musings. Everybody loves a puppet. I don't actually create content. I just create videos and shows. I tend to recap my game sessions and discuss, and plus the occasional Theorycraft video. My game of choice is AD&D First Edition, but I also have a great love of OSC, basic D&D, that sort of thing, and I did spend 30 years playing Second Ed.
You spent 30 years playing the best edition of the game, and then you backed off. What is wrong with you, sir? Who corrupted you? What cult did you join?
I joined the OSR, brother.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. Let's continue on here in a clockwise manner, and we'll talk to Cody. Who are you, sir? What content or products do you create, and what is your tabletop RPG experience?
Well, I think most everybody around here knows me. I'm Cody, or GM Cody, as I'm known as on YouTube. I've been playing role-playing games for almost 30 years. Ever since I was a young kid, I've played a lot of different role-playing games. and mostly old school stuff. That's kind of what I dig. And, I just like talking shit, drinking beer, and listening to good tunes. So.
Awesome. Hey, you know what? Tunes, beer, and tabletop RPGs. That sounds like a. Where do I sign up? Forget the OSR. I want to sign up for that. What's the acronym? All right. And then finishing up here, last but not least, we have the basic expert here. Who are you, sir? What contents or products you create? Not all of them. You create a lot of stuff. And what is your tabletop RPG experience?
So my name is John, or people know me as a basic expert. I make videos, although I've been kind of lackadaisical on that front lately because just been really busy with Kickstarter fulfillment and things like that. I make lots of stuff. Aside from that, recently, like I said, I had a Kickstarter for a Makuhito, which is like based off of White Box, which is Aztec sort of themed gaming, and I just recently did a 0E clone that kind of incorporates chainmail with White Box here, spelled that way. And I started, I'm probably the least as far as in the hobby as everyone here, though, which is kind of funny to me. I started with 4th edition, the most hated edition probably, and kind of worked my way backwards. So now I play 0E or AD&D BX, all those old school TSR editions. Those are my favorite.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's since I wouldn't say we have limited time because we're supposed to stay on time today. So let's just start jumping into the questions, and we'll start right off the bat with Sean on this one. So our first segment for today is about exploring the OSR and what the roots and appeal of the OSR. So, Sean, what is the old school Renaissance, or do you go by some other R? And why has it gained such a following?
Renaissance, revival, whatever, I mean, I think it's basically those of us who either have adhered to the games we started with back in the day when the hobby was still in its infancy, or those who have found it subsequently, right? But it's an adherence to my mind, it's an adherence to those older style games and a philosophy of play as well. Something that the modern games tend to have a more narrative bent. We have to tell a story, and the DM needs to fudge it to make sure the story is seen to completion. Characters are safe; they have plot armor until it's the big boss. Things like that didn't exist if you play the OSR sort of by the book. You're in the thick of it. The dice fall where they will, and I think that's the philosophy of play. That's where I see the OSR sort of falling.
Okay. Would you? I thought I heard it in there, so I'll ask you. What do you think are the key principles that define the OSR for you? I know it seems like you kind of already answered that to some degree, but if you can hone in on that just a touch.
Well, it's, I think to articulate it, the best way is letting the dice fall where they will. We're playing a game here. We understand that it's a game. We understand that, my precious character is not going to be protected by God on high or the DM. The dice are God, right? And so we accept that. We want to explore. We want to find new things, but we're not relying on the almighty narrative to save our butts. And I think that's a major difference. That doesn't mean there aren't or weren't narrative games. It's just that what drives the narrative is different philosophically. The story emerges as opposed to the story is predicated, if that makes any sense.
It does to me. It's up to the audience, though.
It's up to the audience. Shut up, Sean. You don't know what you're talking about. No, I think, and a lot of the older games that were they were in their, their infancy. The designers were still figuring this shit out. So, it's weird that there's almost a purity to, wonky rule systems, rules light, rules are games where they hadn't quite figured out everything or didn't want to put too much complexity. Not that there weren't complex games. And I think, harkening back to that style of play or harkening back to maybe the intended style of play or the style of play that the creators used while creating the games. Because I know as a kid, we played the power fantasy, we played the narrative games, even in the 80s, it's what we wanted. We didn't want to die. It sucked to die. But when you grow up and you play the games more to the rules as written, there's more of an experience there that just grabs you. It's a je ne sais quoi that just, it's like, holy fuck, the game's much more exciting when there are stakes.
Yep, I agree completely. All right. Oh wait, am I allowed to say that as the facilitator here? Well, I said it anyway. All right.
I like being agreed with. Yes. Anyway, so I'm kind of rambling.
That's not my MO. My MO isn't to agree with people. What the hell? All right. Let's.
Off
I might have an addendum when I hear what the others have to say. My synapses will fire. I'm getting dehydrated.
No problem. Well, let's move on to Cody. I'll ask you the same question. What is the old school Renaissance, and why has it gained such a following?
What is the old school Renaissance? Well, that has changed over time.
Ooh.
When the old school Renaissance started, it really started around 2006, and what kicked this off was 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, because it was such a drastic departure from all the other previous editions of D&D. It probably had the biggest backlash up to that point from the D&D fans. So a lot of the old school D&D fans started to really resent 3rd edition D&D and started going, either stayed playing 2nd edition, or they went further back and started playing other editions, or they played 3rd edition. You know, they hadn't been playing in a long time, came into 3rd edition after like a long lapse and realized this was not the game they grew up playing, and went back to the older game they grew up playing. The other thing that kicked it off was Castles and Crusades.
Oh, really? Okay.
Which was probably the first retro clone OSR game, but the OSR really didn't kick off as we know it today till like 2006, and it started in all the forums, right? Like Dragon's Foot, what was the other one? Knights and Knaves, or Knave House, L House, or whatever. The original Dungeons and Dragons discussion forum, all these forums, which I'm sure Sean is very familiar with, and I used to haunt these places quite often. And basically what happened is people saw Castles and Crusades and Osric and were like, hold on, wait a minute. There's this thing called the Open Gaming License. We can bring all these old out-of-print games back in print, and we can polish them up a little bit, and we can introduce this to a new generation of gamers, as well as have, a new version to play that, we can pass on. We can keep the legacy alive, essentially. So that's where it really started. Osric started it. Then you had Labyrinth Lord, and you had Swords and Wizardry, and that really, all these initial games around 2006, 2008, and it all started on these forums. All this old school D&D players, and then it just picked up momentum. And then what happened is, you had things like Drive Through RPG and Lulu, and it made indie RPG publishing easier than ever. So all of a sudden, you could actually publish those games and make money and sell them. And all this stuff started gaining more popularity. But it has evolved and changed since then, because you have a newer generation that's come in and they're like, oh, this is cool. But they're more interested in playing these old school games for a different reason. Not necessarily they're trying to adhere to an old school style, or that they're trying to revisit their past for nostalgia's sake. They see a new way to approach role-playing game design and philosophy, and play philosophy and game design. And they've gone wild with it, right? You have all these different types of games that are spin-offs of D&D, or just take ideas. Like, one of the essential ideas, I think, for a lot of these game designers is rules light, right? That, like Sean was saying, that the referee is more in control than the players, and you don't have a lot of skills, you don't have a lot of feats, you don't have all these special abilities. You just have some stats and your gear and a class and maybe a level, and you're good to go, right? It's pretty simple stuff. And from that idea, people have gone crazy and created all types of games. So I think the definition of OSR used to be very specific. Basically, what Sean is describing was the original vision of what the OSR was. But now it's gone in all different types of directions, and you have all these sub factions and stuff. The OSR, to me, I feel like it's the best analogy I can come up with is kind of like punk rock music. So when punk rock started in 1977, well, sort of, there were proto-punk bands, but when it like kicked off and, the Sex Pistols came out in 1977, started this punk rock revolution, everybody copied the Sex Pistols, right? And that was the initial like OSR movement. But then post-punk came along a couple years later, and it took punk rock in totally different directions. So that's kind of how I view the OSR. I think there's like a loose ether of a mentality, and there's an ethos to it, which I think is, don't worry about the rules too much. The rules are not king for the most part. Like they're rules light, and there's a lot of DM fiat. And I think also the whole idea of, let the dice roll where they may. Death is a real possibility. All that stuff that Sean was saying, I think floats in that ethos too. And I'll shut up and pass the baton over to.
Well, I've got 3 follow-ups for you. 2 of them are really quick. I'm asking this out of pure curiosity.
Yeah.
Was Castles and Crusades first or Osric? And I said, now I know you mentioned Osric, but when you said Castles and Crusades, I was like, oh, really? Because I always had heard that Osric was the start of the OSR.
So Castles and Crusades came out first, to my knowledge. They came out in like 2002 or 2003. And I don't see that came out before the OSR movement really took off. But I think that was kind of the template for a lot of people to say, oh, somebody else can create like a D&D clone or type of game, old school D&D type of game, and do it legally. So I think Castles and Crusades really set that precedence first, even though wasn't considered at the time OSR. I think it really was. Osric, though, really kicked off the movement, though. Like that was like the first thing that was like, hey, we did it. Like this is, and then that really, after that, you had all types of games.
I'm going to lose all. Didn't Gygax himself work on the first version of Castles and Crusades? Like, wasn't that supposed to be his 3rd edition?
He was involved with it, definitely. I don't know.
He consulted, I think.
Did he? Yeah, he did a lot of consulting, and he was going to write some like Castle Greyhawk and some other stuff for it, but I guess he probably died for that happened, or I don't really know all the details of that. So
okay, I have 2 more, but I'm actually going to move on to Basic Expert. We'll see how he answers. Maybe I'll bring these back up. But John, we're on to you now with the same question that I asked them, which is, what is the old school Renaissance and why has it gained such a following?
Well, I think like our diverse takes here shows just like how different, everyone's perception of this like little niche subgenre is. And like, Cody here referenced punk. Like, I think if I were to give an example of what I think the OSR is, I would call it like almost like Protestant denominations. There's like lots of different ones, but they have like a lot of similar tenets that are held, but they also have their own little quirky little aspects to it too. But I think what draws people to it is this idea of trying to go back and figure out how to play these old games. And I know I can only speak for myself. And what drew me to it is, having, like I said, I started in 4th edition, which is a very like leans very much into that heroic power fantasy kind of game where your character is very powerful even at level 1, and you have lots of abilities. And then moving into 5th edition, which kind of toned it back a little bit, but it's still very much in that like power fantasy realm. And then having played other games as well during that time, you sort of wonder like, well, how did this all start? And so then you start to go back and look, and I think at that time the OSR, Cody mentioned this, like those old rules weren't available, and I think the original goal was to try and get the original rules into people's hands so they could experience what TSR D&D was about, because WotC was not releasing that stuff. And I would say ultimately the OSR was successful in that initial goal, because now Wizards of the Coast has kind of forced their hand. Like now you can get 1st edition print on demand, you can get 2nd edition print on demand, you can get original Dungeons and Dragons PDFs. Wizards of the Coast just released that 50th. I'm not going to get it, but that 50th anniversary book. The ultimate goal succeeded now that the original rules, unaltered, unfiltered through the nostalgia of other creators, is there for you to investigate for yourself. And I think that's what's kind of for me has drawn me to it, is the ability to look at these old rules and I don't come at these games with nostalgia, because again, I'm not old enough to have that nostalgia. So I kind of approach these games and these rules, and I look at what the rules say, and I'm interested in the kind of game those rules create. And so for me, it's sort of like nostalgia aside, all that stuff aside, when you play these games, what kind of game is produced when you try and play them? Like, what does it feel like? What's the experience like? And for me, that's a lot of fun. And I kind of liken it, what I like to do, to like gaming archaeology, right? Where you're looking at these old dusty rules and you're like, how does this play? What is the implication of this weird rule, that nobody talks about, for instance. But if you throw that rule into your game, how does that affect your campaign? Like, that's kind of stuff really excites me. And I know it excites a lot of the people that I run with as well. And I think to a greater degree in the OSR, to the people on the outside that kind of are looking at retro games, that old school games and older editions, that sort of appeals to them too, even if it is in something like old school Centrals or a clone Osric or For Golden Glory or Swords and Wizardry, something like that. Like, even within those that I think aren't pure clones, they're not pure, obviously, one-to-one recreations of those games. There's still something new to discover as far as like a mode of play that has been kind of neglected, like to a large degree in a lot of the modern sphere of the hobby as a whole. So I think that's kind of the appeal there for people.
The follow-up I want to give you is, a couple of you guys have kind of said that it's about this experience. And the one thing that popped in my head both times that I heard this, when you guys had said this, was what I noticed about old school games, or I cannot talk, OSR games versus the more modern style, is the older games were more player driven, and these modern ones are more character driven. Now I'm in the middle. I like a little bit of both. I was like, I have no problem sitting at a table. Your character wouldn't know that. But in the old school game, that's all you had. Like somebody, I think it was Sean said it. You got a character sheet. You had no skills. You had nothing. You just had 6 attributes and a couple of weapons, and there you go. Go figure it out from there. There's no way you could say, well, your character would know that. Well, prove it. At the same time, I think that everything that is so character driven that takes away completely from the player kind of ruins the fact that or lessens the fact that it is still a game. We're still trying to play a game here. And I'm giving that to you first, John, but I'll open that discussion up to everybody.
I just want to clarify. You say character-driven based on a rules perspective, not character-driven based on a character, playing a character perspective, right?
Well, character as well, I guess in that case, yes, because you'd character sheet-driven. How about that?
There, yeah.
Which is actually a style play I don't like, but yeah, it's player driven versus character sheet driven, and then yes, we could go into the really modern, or the more story gaming, which is character driven itself. But I really think that the OSR leads towards that first one anyway, which is more player driven. Sorry, John, that's for you first, and then.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Well, just do you agree with that assessment that it's more player driven back then?
Yeah, I think that kind of harkens back to like the war game sort of vibe that Zero E has. In creating like my Zero E clone, where I kind of try and incorporate aspects of chainmail to fill in the gaps. Having read chainmail and having read Zero E, like it just clicked for me, and I realized like this is a game where players are expected to get hirelings, they're expected to be like movers and shakers in the world, in the campaign world. It's not like Sean mentioned it. It's not like this I have this predetermined story and players need to hit my plot points as a referee, like we gotta get through act 1, 2, and 3, and then we get to the finale and the big bad evil guy. Like that's a very modern, take on how to play the game. Whereas like you look at the number of appearing for like orcs, for example, in Zero E, and it's 30 to 300 in a wilderness encounter. And it's like, I'm sorry, the plot don't care about or the orcs don't care about your plot armor, right? Like if you're a party of 10 and you encounter 300 orcs, you got to figure something out. And so just that in and of itself, I think expresses like a completely different kind of game than what we are as modern gamers are expecting or are used to. So yeah, I think that's part of it. Like part of it is like players are supposed to go out there and like really make an impact on the campaign world, and then the referee sort of responds, and it's sort of this like mutual world creation together. And I think the modern perspective is like the DM is the only world creator, and then the players get to experience it like a theme park, right? So
okay, I'll let you guys jump in if you have any questions, comments, concerns for each other.
I agree with the basic expert for sure. Like, and that's where role-playing games came out of, was these wargaming groups that were doing wargaming campaigns, and they were doing a lot of negotiations and role playing, and they would do odd situations during the actual war game. And so that's where that evolved out of. And that was very player driven with those groups. And I think that's, I think, the basic expert's absolutely correct. And it's a thing that can be, I think it's a very healthy thing that's come back around in gaming, is the player driven game. Because, that whole concept, no matter what kind of rules you're using, it doesn't matter. You could be playing anything, but that player driven game, I think really adds a different dynamic to role-playing games in general. And, I've always tried to run my games that way, but I think it's starting to get back in people's heads now with that philosophy and all these old school philosophies that the OSR has brought on. You don't have to take them all. You can take bits and pieces of it and incorporate it into whatever type or style of game you play, So yeah, I think that's a very good point and a very important thing, and a very important aspect of old school play in general. Was it was supposed to be a more player driven experience, and the players were supposed to go seek out adventure. They weren't supposed to just be like, hey there, adventurer, I need you to go blah, blah, blah. No, you got to go, I'm going to go to the tavern, look around. There's a sketchy looking elf, in the corner there. I'm going to go talk to the sketchy looking elf. Okay, well, the elf tells you that, there's a cave to the north, blah, blah, blah. And so, that was kind of more the old school style of play. And maybe you don't want to go do that. Well, screw that. We're going to go to the city to the north that's, 5 days away. Okay, well, and you would do that, right? And you just kind of roll with it. And the DM would roll on some tables or make some shit up, and that's a really enjoyable experience, and it's a different way to play. But I think it's something that you can incorporate in any style of play that you play. Right? It doesn't matter on the rules.
I'm going to be the outlier here and point out that that's true of D&D, but even D&D developed skills and stuff like that to flesh out what the character actually knows. But other old school games outside of D&D, like Traveller, would count as old school. That's a skill-based game. And the idea was your character was fleshed out. There were things you knew about, like, okay, this guy was mathematical, or he knew computers, or maybe he didn't. So there was, even in some old school systems, maybe not D&D, early D&D, there was this aspect of, okay, what's on the sheet? This will determine what your character knows, the level of skill and expertise. So there was an element of that, and it did creep in to D&D fairly soon. Like, even as first edition had NWPs that came with the Oriental Adventures and with the guides, the survival guides. Even basic D&D, BACME introduced a skill system. So I think it's one of those things that it was out of necessity. When the game was being created, they had the player knowledge versus the DM. So, you figured it out. But somewhere along the way, somebody said, we got to add this in because we need to know what the characters know to play within those parameters. So I think it's an important consideration that skill-based play was, I guess, an inevitable development in all games.
Probably, help to alleviate some arguments.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, how many players, and I had this playing Beyond the Supernatural as a kid, as a teen. Suddenly my friend who was 16, 17 years old, he wanted to do advanced medical things. Oh, it's so simple. I just do a Y incision. It's like, yeah, where did you gain this medical knowledge? And it's like, oh, well, I saw it on TV, so my character must know it, right? So it's like, no, what does your character sheet say? What can you do? And it's like, oh, he's just a high school graduate, so he knows how to do a Y incision, you say? So I think that was a natural. It was inevitable that something like that would be added. But now, to the point of the character, the player playing, I agree. It's like, if you can find that balance of the player knows what their character can do and can play within that, then you get that sweet spot, and they will interact with the scene, but saying, hey, my character's an elf, so I'm extra good at finding secret doors, for instance, and that's an ability, not necessarily a skill. But they don't say, well, somebody playing an elf won't say, well, I can do this, so I will, and somebody who's not an elf say, well, I can't do it, so I won't bother. Let's let everybody, check for secret doors. Oh, look, the elf has a higher chance. Or if you add in the NWPs and the skills, my character has survival. Great, my character doesn't, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to help forage for food so we don't starve, right? I just have a less chance of identifying the edible stuff. So you still want the players to engage on that level and interact with the scenario. Just keep the skills on the periphery and don't make it about what you think you can and cannot do. Am I rambling again? I'm rambling again.
No, I think you make a good point, because it kind of, there's a line that you don't want to cross with skills in a game, and from a design standpoint, in my opinion. And like Traveler, for instance, that's a very interesting game, because like that whole game is essentially a dead level, because you really can't, in Classic Traveler, 1977 Classic Traveler, you cannot really increase your skills. You can with like 4 years, and you can with like temporary study, but then you lose them if you quit studying. Like those bonuses go away.
You mean skills atrophy like they do in real life?
Yeah. But it's interesting, because like all of Classic Traveler is like a dead level. And actually, I would say that Traveler is very much related to D&D, because to me, when you look at Traveler, you can see how I think Mark Miller played original Dungeons and Dragons, and that is a 2d6 game, like the man-to-man tables and chainmail. I think it's very much linked. But there are penalties to, like, you can try, like, for instance, forward observation in Traveler, like you can try, and like you said, you can try and do this, but there's going to be a penalty because you're not trained in it. And I feel like a lot of modern games kind of lack that. Like there's this, like I said, there's this sweet spot where you don't want to feel like your character sheet is like a video game controller and you're pushing buttons.
Right.
I push this button and my character does this. Like that's boring. But it also becomes a non-game at a certain point if it's just like, well, I just do it, or there's no risk, there's no mechanic, you got to strike that balance, I feel like, of game versus just giving it to a player or making a ruling or GM fiat, in my opinion. Too much GM fiat.
Yeah, and common sense has to be used, like, okay, even if you're not technically trained in a skill, doesn't mean you can't try to do something, but it depends on the skill.
Land a plane.
Exactly. That's something somebody's not just going to be able to do, but okay, something very simple like chopping a tree down. Chopping a tree down is not easy if you've never done it, but it's possible for you to figure it out through trial and
after
error.
smashing your house.
Right, but you get what
I
I'm
make
saying.
the wedge this way and it falls on the house. Oops.
Yeah, but that is a skill you can learn through trial and error. Whereas, flying a plane, you need training and practice, right? You can't just say, well, I'm going to try it. Okay, well, you have a 0.01% of actually figuring it out, right?
Well, hey, what's going to be great about this topic today is I think we could all sit here and talk for 9 hours, and I would love to. Unfortunately, we don't have 9 hours, so I'm going to have to move it on to the next question. I'm just dumping the follow-up questions I have for now, and maybe we'll do a part 2 again in a couple of months. I don't know. But so let's move on. By the way, for folks who have super chatted questions, comments, and those I've also just kind of identified a few other comments I want to bring up. I will do that at the end of the segment, just as a reminder to people. If you want it read immediately, it's $20 or more. And the purpose for that isn't to bilk you out of money. It's so that we're not actually interrupting the good conversation that we're having here, unless it's really, really worth it. So we're gonna move to Cody for this one to start this question off. And this is going to tag in some modern gamers. So why do modern players, and it's funny because we've had a bunch on my Discord talk about this over the years that are, I got into the game with 5e or 3e, and they're like, I love White Box. And I got to be honest, I've literally never played White Box in my life, but they love some of that old stuff. So why do modern players and GMs find OSR games appealing despite the availability, and I think somebody said earlier, of more complex systems?
Well, I think there's probably a number of reasons. It depends on the person. For me, like I didn't grow up in the 80s. I was born in the 80s, but I got it. I play White Box and AD&D first edition stuff. For me personally, it was just curiosity. I was interested to see where the game came from, and it looked interesting, and I found something I really liked there. Like I just liked the way it played. It had a different feel to it than AD&D second edition or whatever I was playing at the time. But I think for the modern players right now, it's a different thing. I think they look at it as freedom, right? Like they see fifth edition, it's cluttered up with all these skills and powers and yada, yada. And that appeals to a lot of people, but it also doesn't appeal to a certain number of younger people, right? Like they want something really simple, something free something they can tinker with too. I think that's important to point out, is that, you know, the OSR really does encourage a lot of tinkering and a lot of creative freedom. And it's really hard to do that with, I'm not saying you can't do it. It's just hard to do it with a more complex system. But with something very basic like, you know, white box D&D, shit, you can make, the sky's the limit, you know, because literally you've gone back down to just, you know, the first rock and the foundation of the house. And from there, you can build up to whatever you want, right? You can go crazy. Same with, you know, BX D&D. That's why there's so many clones based on BX D&D, because you can just go crazy with it. So I think that appeals to a lot of younger people, and also just the rules light nature of it. You know, maybe they don't like the clutter of all the feats and skills and talents and powers and stuff. And I think another aspect of it is something we brought up in the first topic is, you know, it's a very different style of play. You know, so if you're playing old school D&D, which is what the OSR focuses on mainly, there are other, you know, genres and games that the OSR goes into, but mainly it's old school D&D, something around that atmosphere is what most of these OSR games go for. And in old school D&D, it's a very different game from what 5th edition D&D or 4th edition or even 3rd edition is. It's deadly, it's scary, and it's, you know, it's zero to hero. It's not hero to superhero. And so I think that is something that appeals, you know, it's not going to appeal to everybody, but I think some younger people are like, wait a minute, this is actually really fun. You know, this is so rewarding to go from zero to hero, you know, and actually that slow build and that threat of death and dying. You know, so I think all those aspects is going to appeal. I think different aspects of the OSR is going to appeal to different people. And I think those are some of the aspects that's going to appeal to people, right?
I've decided I'm going to, unless something triggers me here, it sparks my imagination here. I'm going to just actually ask all of you guys the same follow-up question. So I'm going to skip over to the basic expert already here. And you are the newest one. You came in with 4th edition. Mm-hmm. So you'd probably be considered one of these more modern players. So why do modern players and game masters, I should probably have dungeon masters in there, find OSR games appealing despite the availability of more complex systems?
Well, I think a lot of what Cody said is true. I think it's also just like there's an aesthetic, and I'm going to say there's a mysteriousness to old school games too. There's a mysticism to them, right? Like when I was working on my 0E clone, like I looked at, for the longest time, I looked at 0E D&D, the 3 LBBs, as like this very archaic sort of mystery. Like how do you play this stupid game, you know? It doesn't make any sense. You're reading it's so bare bones. And I'm of the opinion that a lot of that is fixed with chainmail, obviously, but yeah, there you go. Wow, there you go. Original one right there. And so I think there's like an aesthetic and a mysticalness to like looking at the old stuff and mastering it and figuring it out. Because while it is kind of simple, I think somewhat what it is there's a depth to this. I think some of the simpleness that I've discovered that really appeals to me is that there's always something, because not everything is always laid out and it's not always clearly defined. And so there's a lot of depth to the mastery of the rules. They come across as simple, but actually when you're digging deep into them and you're really trying to figure these things out, there's a level of depth to it where, you know, you can actually come, in my opinion, for instance, doing this, and I try to do it with White Box, is you can come to a very crunchy game by implementing aspects, for instance, from chainmail into the 3 LBBs. For instance, you try and implement weapon versus armor tables, or you're trying to implement weapon class, and you're trying to figure out what the heck fighting capability means in 0E. Like a lot of people just hand wave that, like, I don't know what that means, so we're not going to use it. But like when you look at fighting capability, like it creates this super crunchy game, and you can almost get like this proto 1E game out of that, just as an example. And so I think that's part of it too. There's like a mystery to it. There's an aesthetic to it, which kind of goes with what Cody was saying too. Like it's a different feel. There's a different look and feel of the game and the style of campaign. and it just creates, it's a better game for, I think, again, like we talked about, player driven games, like sandbox style games. It's just a better system for it. It's just set up better for it. It scales well to mass combat better than 5e does, for example. Mechanically, because of hit dice and all that kind of stuff. The obviously the 5e hit dice are weird. It's not like a traditional old school, you know, everything's a D8 or a D6 in an OD&D or something like that. And so you're because of that, because there's like different scaling, there's this aesthetic, all this, it just becomes like something you've never experienced before. If all you've played is newer games, if all you've played is 4E, if all you've played are those games, you come to this and you're like, wow, this is very different. It can have the heroic aspects, but it has all this other stuff too that as you dig deep into it, becomes very expansive. It becomes very there's a lot of depth to it. A lot that's not been explored.
All right. And Sean, same question for you. Why do modern players, obviously this is going to be everybody's individual opinions maybe on this or anecdotal stories, but why do modern players and GMs find OSR games appealing despite the availability of more complex systems?
Well, I agree with all of the above. Yeah, there is a mystique to it, and I think part of it is boredom too. I've met a lot of players who play 5th Ed, and they just kind of get sick of it when it's played to the philosophy that's espoused by WotC telling players or DMs to give players what they want. You know, it's D&D on easy mode, effectively, and you know, then there are some players who want the power fantasy. They're going to stick with 5e and the modern systems that allow them to play safely without dying. But then you get the occasional person who's like, you know, I want something a little more, and those are the people who are going to jump to old school games for the reasons you outlined. That there's more danger, there's more excitement, there's more stakes, and it's really just a philosophical jump, because I run a 5e game and I run it in an old school style. It's super deadly. We have a character graveyard. Players are like, you told me this game was easy and hard to die, and meanwhile they're dying left, right, and center. So you can do it with the newer system, but I had to tweak the system. Whereas you can go to an old school system, you can pick up old school essentials, which is, you know, it's a killer game. You'll have a character graveyard after 2 sessions, you know, and there's once you get past that shock, and this is what I've noticed bringing new players and 5e players or modern players into old school essentials. Once you get past that shock, it's like, holy fuck, when my character scraped himself out of a battle with 1 hit point, I was tense. I was on the edge of my seat. That was fun. And then they come back, the ones who the ones who can endure. I literally had a 65-year-old man who did start with OD&D melt down and cry like a baby because his character died. But,
oh, wow. I mean, I've gotten attached to characters, but never that way.
And I was surprised. Like he loves 5th Ed, but he's played all the versions. You know, like he started playing in '74 when D&D came out, and he's played them all. And so I figured he understood how old school worked. But for the most part, yeah, I think it alleviates the boredom. It's a different feeling. And you know, you could say people are doing it to experiment. You know, like I started with like basic. I started with Beckme, and I play 5e. I think 5e's got some good elements to it. It's not my favorite, but I enjoy it. But I've also taken what I know from old school and imported certain ideas to give it an old school feel. And I think you'll see players doing that too. They're going to look to the old ways to see how they can make their modern game sort of more interesting or spice it up. So there's another thing.
One of the things that I've seen on my Discord a lot when people have talked about, you know, especially the people who started with 3rd, 4th, or 5th edition, and, you know, they get exposed to one of the earlier editions, usually some sort of BX, in my experience, is that at first they hear about the risk reward, or basically, oh, characters die, you know, this happens. And it's true. It absolutely is true. That happens. But they found out that they ultimately liked that risk reward more. They didn't like knowing that it was like a computer game where effectively you could save it. You know, they didn't like the idea. They didn't realize they didn't like it until they played the older stuff. But having that, hold on, we have to think about this fight, or we have to maybe think about leaving this fight. Basic Expert said it before, even up through 2nd edition AD&D, 300 orcs was a possibility.
It's a possibility, yeah. And that's you sort of touched on that, is, you know, deciding, shit, do we engage or do we withdraw? Whereas a lot of players who play 5th Ed, they automatically come in with the assumption that the game is catered to their level and victory is always possible. And when you go back to an older game, and the DM especially makes it very clear that none of that applies, you have to use your fucking head to decide whether or not this is a situation you can handle or where you're going to bug out. And it becomes interesting, especially when they're running away from a situation they knew they couldn't handle and the monster is chasing them. They don't just go run around a corner, take a breather, and continue adventuring. No, they have to run back to town, right? Which can be fun.
All right, let me ask the follow-up question here, and this is for all of you. I don't care how you jump in, and then after this, I'll do the super chats, and we'll move on to the next segment. What role do you believe OSR games play in preserving the history of tabletop RPGs?
I think, I guess I'll start. I think I'll say that they kind of serve that role already, because again, I think that it kind of forced Wizards of the Coast hand. Now, whether or not you want to give money to Wizards of the Coast for clones or for original versions of the game, that's another thing. But I think it's neat that it kind of forced their hand to be like, there's people out there that want this stuff, and we're getting, there's clones out there. There's like these little indie RPG creators they're making money off of something that we have the rights to. So we should release it now. We should release the Rules Cyclopedia on print on demand and second and first and OD&D and all these things, some of the old modules and things like that. And I think that it's done. It's kind of kept the interest alive in allowing that to occur, I think, so that people can have access to this older way to play. It kind of like kept the torch alive. It preserved it in the early 2000s, up until the current point, so that we could, these games aren't lost. It's not just like this old moldy game that no one talks about anymore. There's that TSR era is still very much alive and well loved, even by people that weren't born at a time to experience it while it was then.
Do you think that WotC would have, without the OSR, do you think WotC would have released those older games?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I don't think so. I think they saw money and they're like, we want part of that, So, I have some print on demand versions of older stuff. Like, I've given WotC money for that kind of stuff in the past, but because it's stuff it's just hard to find. Like Cody here has original. He has a box set of OD&D. Like that's expensive. Like if I want that, like I don't even want to pay. I don't really want to even play with that.
That's a 5-digit expenditure, especially if it's sealed.
Yeah. So it's like being able to get the original rules in your hand, because I think another thing it's done is it's created interest in it, at least for me, because I can look at something like Swords and Wizardry, or I could look at something like Osric, and I can go, this is really cool, but this is clearly someone's interpretation of what those rules are and how they're applied. I want to read the original thing. And so like I have Osric, I have Swords and Wizardry, I have all these games, but I also have the originals too, because it kind of piqued my interest in like, okay, I've learned what this person thinks the rules are, but I want to think for myself and what the rules are. I want to see what they are myself. And so I think it's also done that for a lot of younger, newer gamers too, to be like, well, now I have access to this stuff, and I can kind of see for myself what it was all about and why did this get so popular? Why are people so obsessed with this? So, yeah.
Okay. Anything else, or should we hit some chat?
No, I think Basic Expert pretty much summed it up. That's pretty much what I was going to say. So,
well, the PDFs of older stuff have been available for well over 20 years. Like I remember getting the PDF of Temple of Elemental Evil in like 2000, when Drive Thru RPG was in its infancy. So it's not like it's a new thing. I'd be curious to see the numbers though. Like how many sales did they have in the early 2000s versus now? Right.
Well, I will bring up that I remember specifically right after 3rd edition came out, there was a huge influx of old school D&D players petitioning to have the old books re-released. And Wizards of the Coast just said basically nothing. They didn't even answer. It was just fuck you and silence.
They've been drip feeding, like almost the entire catalog of old stuff is now available. But it took a while.
Yeah, and now they actually did, and they did do like those fancy reprints, and they've done overpriced versions of the original
I don't know how
editions.
much they screwed up first edition, but they completely screwed up second edition by removing the actual Elmore Caldwell Parkinson Easley art from it.
They reprinted the black binding, not the
Yeah,
not the
right.
original.
That's right. It was the black binding first. You're correct.
Yeah, it was the 95 edition, the revised edition, is what they printed.
And nobody likes the black books.
I don't have a problem with it.
All right. Okay, I'm kicking you off the stream. Where's the? All right, let's.
Aesthetically, I agree. I like the older ones, but the black books still serve their purpose.
All right, so is BRP? What is BRP? I feel like I should know what that is.
Basic role playing.
Yeah, it's the Chaosium system.
Okay. It's Chaos. I always just call it Chaosium. I didn't realize it was a name. Okay.
This is
they meant Basic Fantasy, the Chris Gonnerman one.
Yeah. This has become kind of a thing, and I wish it'd become more of a thing. Is that the OSR is so focused on D&D, but there's all these other great games from the past. Why can't we make like a homage to this great game and update it and clean it up and bring it? And that's starting to happen a little bit, but I wish it would happen a little bit more.
Licensing, man, when somebody owns the current license for something that
Right,
you want,
but-
that was,
Especially if it's an IP. Yeah.
But it can be done, and it's been done, and you can do it. Like a really good example is Against the Dark Master. Well, it's just MERP in disguise. They just changed some things, they tweaked some things, and they added some things to make it their own. But it's still really Rollmaster and MERP at its core, So I do kind of wish that more people would break out of the D&D mentality. There's more games than D&D. Let's get real, guys.
There are.
Heresy.
Yeah, heresy.
And old school D&D is awesome. I love D&D. I'm a huge D&D fanatic, and I love the history of it. I love playing D&D, but I do like playing other games. And there was a lot of other great games that came out, even at the very beginning of role-playing games. And I think people need to take a look at those too. And I think they are, though. There's other games starting to happen. And I think we talked about this at the beginning of the stream is what's the definition of OSR? And that's becoming more and more fuzzy as time goes on. Which I don't think is a bad thing, because it just inspires more creativity and more freedom, and people are going to make more cool stuff.
So I first of all, Mercurius, thank you very much for your $2 Australian. That's worth like a postage stamp or something here in America, but I appreciate that. But I flopped over to Squirrel Hermit's comment here because of what you just said there. In my opinion, OSR is an approach and a philosophy. I don't personally have a term for what OSR is, but I think I've talked with all three of you at some point or another that maybe it won't happen on this panel. I thought it might, but I've actually angered some people, like to the point of them using language that I might have used on an old rant stream, because I say that Forbidden Lands is an OSR game because it meets all the criteria of all of the old school D&D feel. Doesn't use D&D rules, but all the feel from racial tropes to survival mechanics to hex crawls to you name it, it's there. Dangerous magic, just you go down the line, and so much is there. But man, people get really incensed with the. Can I find? I'm not gonna find the comment now, but where they're just like, nope, if it's not 6-stat D&D, it's not right. It's like, whoa, I don't know, I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I love Classic Traveler. I love a lot of those older games. I have Gamma World and stuff like that, which is a little bit different than regular D&D. So, Gamma World First Edition. This is where I think part of the problem is with the OSR label as well. There's like because the OSR means so many different things to so many people, but at the end of the day, too, it's also just a marketing label. on Drive-Thru RPG that you can tick, and people kind of like as long as you're remotely in that sphere, like people will buy it as well. So my fear, and maybe we can touch on it later, we don't have to touch on it now. My fear is that yeah, that's a cool game. My fear is that there's that 5e problem of 5e people always trying to shovel everything into 5e, and I think there's a BX problem where everyone wants to shovel everything into BX, and there's other games out there that would be better suited for what you want to do than BX D&D, in my opinion.
Okay.
But
Yeah, but I think again, they say it's a marketing thing. Somebody wants to associate with BX because that'll attract attention. That they can put that in a tag for keyword searches and stuff like that.
mhm.
All right, and just another thing for folks out there, a lot of great comments out there. I don't have the time to put them all up, but you guys keep chatting. I'm reading them. I just don't have the time to put everything up there. Bear the Gen X GM gives 10 Canadian dollars, which is probably worth a little more than the Australian ones. They're closer. I don't know. So see y'all later. I think he's playing a game tonight, if I remember correctly. I thought I saw the stream scheduled for playing.
He just popped in at
Oh, did he?
7:54, so he's still lurking somewhere.
Oh, he's haunting people. Your Wrong says, been playing Old School Essentials and loving it. That's an OSR game, most definitely. You guys were talking about that.
Right in the name.
Yeah, fair enough. Full Metal Dragon says OSR was labeled when OSR came out. Didn't take off until about 2008, 9, and Castles and Crusades just sort of attached itself to it after that. If any one of you, I don't know the history of any of this stuff. We don't have to dive deeply into it, but if anybody wants to agree or make a quick correction, go ahead.
I think that's pretty much what I said.
Okay.
Well, I think
Yeah.
the Chenaults, maybe they've changed their opinion, but the Chenault brothers have said that they don't personally term Castles and Crusades as OSR themselves, despite being influenced by a lot. They personally don't consider it OSR themselves. So,
yeah,
Fair
I mean, it came out before the OSR movement, and they weren't trying to be like old school. They were just trying to basically do a different take on first/second edition, and remove a lot of the stuff from third edition. They weren't necessarily trying to make an OSR game. That didn't really exist. But I think that did inspire a lot of the OSR community, is what I was trying to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, Bear, thank you for your 10 Canadian dollars. Nagahide Hobbies for $10 says, is only fantasy OSR, or would Rifts or any Palladium game be OSR in the panelists' opinion? All right, let's start at the top. Well, actually, no, we'll start with Basic Expert of this one. Is Palladium, that came out in 1981, I think it was, with Mechanoids, is that OSR or no?
I don't know. I have Mechanoid. I have the Mechanoid trilogy. I have Rifts, and I have Heroes Unlimited. Those are the Palladium games that I currently own right now. I'm not really a Palladium guy, but it is an old game. It is just Kevin's it started with Kevin's just AD&D game, but like his autistically homebrewed one.
But it doesn't look like anything like AD&D anymore. Let's be honest. That's not
but you know what? I appreciate that, because like he homebrewed something. It's no longer D&D. He made it his own, and I respect that. That's a respectable path to take. But I would say it's up there in that like genre. I think you can run those games. You could probably run Palladium Fantasy a lot easier in an old school mindset, obviously, than you could like 4th edition D&D, I think. So,
okay.
I have no problem saying like it's old school. It's in that large umbrella of games of that era,
See, there's the OSR, then there's the OS, then there's just O.
Yeah.
Like, which rung are you in? There you go. All right, Sean, what are your thoughts?
Palladium, 100%. 100%. It's always
100%. Okay.
It's of that era. It's of the era when the games are still being developed, and Symbieta evolved it from AD&D, right? Like he started writing for AD&D or Judges Guild. Isn't his name slapped on quite a few Judges Guild stuff? Yeah. So he was writing for AD&D. So he was part of that. And I played many Palladium games in the 80s. Even from a personal perspective, I got the nostalgia kick. So yeah, 100% Palladium games are an OSR.
Okay, and Cody, you know a thing or two about Palladium Fantasy. That's a pretty old game. So
yeah, I played quite a bit of Palladium. Yeah, it's I think it's old school OSR, whatever. I mean, yeah, I mean if it's to me, if it's before. I don't consider 90s gaming really OSR. If it's before the 90s, I mean, 90s is old now, but it's not OSR. if it's from the 80s and back, it's OSR to me. Now, a lot of those games, though, like Sean was talking about earlier in the 80s, don't really hold up to the OSR philosophy per se.
That's true.
Because what happened is it was an evolution of D&D. All these games came out of D&D. and they were their own spin on D&D, and they were trying to make D&D better. So like Palladium Fantasy or Palladium, Palladium in general, the whole system was a way more complex game than D&D, right? And so that kind of goes a little bit against some of the philosophies of OSR, and it just got worse. Rollmaster, and then you had you had all these steps up. Everybody was trying to. There was a time in the 80s where everybody was like stepping up and getting more complex.
I love me some MERP.
I do too. I love that stuff, but it's definitely old school to me. I would call it OSR, but I do think it kind of goes. It kind of breaks and bends the rules of what the OSR philosophy originally was.
Well, Nerdy Ogre says it best here. If it survived the 80s, it's OSR.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's my.
There's our definition going forward.
All right, I'm going to knock out the next 4 comments really quickly here. Calvinoni says, at some point, complexity fights the enjoyment. I tend to agree with that. One of the things, I said I was going to be quick in here, because you guys were just jogging my memory and talking about some of the older school games like MERP and so forth. One of the things I honestly miss from some games, and I don't think they should be all over the place, but I miss charts. Like, there's such this design philosophy nowadays, like can't have charts, can't have something you have to reference. It's got to be something in your head, and you get off the dice.
Nothing random.
Yeah, well, it's sure nothing random also, but like what is wrong with having a chart that you just go, okay, there, boom, that's what happened. I don't understand why that's such a big deal. Why does it have to be all programmed in or just out of the game master's mind? Why can't that chart be something or table be something that, ooh, that's a great way I can use this. And games just don't do that.
If I were to speculate on an answer, I would say because it, even for a split second, takes the DM's engagement on the players onto something else. And, everybody wants the story. Everybody wants that immersive experience where the DM is always engaging with everybody at the table. Now, if I have to go behind my screen and look at a table for a few seconds, that breaks that magic.
It's a game.
I know.
It's not improv hour.
I'm not saying I agree with the philosophy. I'm saying
I know.
Speculation.
I've brought up the point about charts all the time because I love charts, playing all these old school war games and stuff that had charts, and there's something that charts can do. They can add like different elements to the game that you can't get out of just a straight dice roll. And so I think charts they're not necessary, but they're cool. Like, and they don't have to add like a whole. They don't really add any complexity. It's not really, there's not really any more steps there looking at a chart. So I don't really understand the adversity to looking at a chart either. I think people just think they look at a chart and they think, oh, automatically I see like a bunch of numbers on a chart. It's going to be more complex or it's going to add time to the game or
simplify stuff, man.
Yeah, and it allows you to incorporate things that you wouldn't necessarily think of on the fly. Like as a DM, you've already got a million things going through your brain. Thinking of minutia of dungeon dressing or whatever, have your fucking chart, because then it's a surprise for you. Oh, look, there's a drip in the ceiling. Now suddenly the players are going to think it's a big clue, and no, it's just a leak in the ceiling. But it adds.
I love those red herrings.
Yeah, but it adds flavor.
You get them spending an hour but the dungeon master said it. It must be important. It's important because I needed a smoke break. That's what it was. All right. So Edgelord says, I'm interested in that chainmail product TBE mentioned. Also want to get his Aztec RPG. I think he was the one that was talking about your website, but I can't remember. I don't know if you saw the comment, but
that was Zane.
Zane, okay.
Yeah. So this is. I need to relist it on Drift the RPG, but yeah, my whole goal with this was I was tired of referencing 4 books to run my 0E games, so I just shoved it all into one book. So I'm essentially using like, it's $1.50 on Drive-Thru RPG. I'm gonna go back to making it pay what you want, because that was what it was originally was for the PDF, and you can get physical if you want to support. But yeah, it's sort of like my little project with the help of a lot of friends on my Guilded server on the subscribed supporter end of like making something just kind of cool for the hobby, that a version of 0E that hasn't really been out there yet, where we're really trying to incorporate chainmail aspects, things. My biggest gripe with 0E is I hear people say like, oh, it's this rules light like GM Fiat game, and I'm like, no, it's not. It's very crunchy if you add chainmail. It's as crunchy as first edition. Ask anyone in first edition if they use weapon speeds or
Oh yeah,
like that.
100%.
Yeah. It's just like that. That's where all that stuff comes from originally. So it's like that was kind of the goal of that. So
Oh wow. So I didn't realize that we had a $20 super chat earlier. That's my fault, Law Dog. I always screw over Law Dog. Every time he like does some chat or something, his gets messed up in the wash. And we kind of already answered the question, so he got doubly screwed. So Law Dog, thank you for the $20. Sorry, I saw it come in, but I didn't realize it was orange because I'm not on the normal screen right now.
Okay, everybody, quickly repeat what we just said.
Yeah. Well, again, I think everybody here said yes. Either if not OSR, at least OS. So, but thank you, Law Dog. I appreciate that. He also gifted 5 memberships. I didn't see who they went to, but so the folks who got memberships gifted to them, well, guess what? You now have access to not 1,500 videos, but 4,500 videos, including some of those confrontational ones of the past that have got
1 month to get through them all.
Yeah, 1 month to get through them all. Good luck. And then the last one, we're on track for a 4-hour stream, and we can't do that. So the last one I'm going to look at here is Zane Daniel says, the answer to Max's question, in my opinion, is who cares? This is about the question is, what role do you believe OSR games play in preserving the history of tabletop RPGs? Who cares? It's not their responsibility to tell the history of RPGs. Those who care about the history will learn more. Those who don't care won't. Either he's answering a different question or he misunderstood the question that I asked. I didn't say do they have a responsibility to. What role do you believe they have in preserving it? And I think they have a pretty substantial role. Whether you're doing Hyperborea or you're doing Sword and Wizardry or you're doing Osric, you guys have mentioned a bunch of other ones here. I think that it does, even if you consider them to be just somebody's homebrew. It's still homebrew of BX or homebrew of 1E or something similar to that. I think it does a lot to show the imagination. I just kind of consider a lot of these things to be settings instead of their own. If you look at Dragonlance Adventures from first edition, there's a lot of people like second edition. No, it came out first. The hardcover book is first edition. It changed a lot of rules. No more paladins, but you had the 3 different levels of Knights of Solamnia. It turned the mages effectively into clerics with limited schools that they could cast from. I could go on and on. But it still used D&D as the core. That's kind of that's a homebrew setting. Well, I look at Hyperborea as essentially just being another homebrew setting. That's not a disparagement. If you guys have any quick thoughts on that, go ahead. Otherwise, we're moving on to the next segment.
No, I mean, from a historical perspective, just existing and just talking about it will passively keep it in the consciousness. Like people will refer back to it. Now people are making older games and looking to the older stuff. So that history will be there because people are constantly going to be looking at it and researching it and talking about it. And so it's there. It's passively, it's with us.
Okay. Well, I hope everybody, please like, subscribe, and share. We're going to move on to the second segment in a moment, which is going to be accessibility to new players. Hopefully we can speed it up a little bit. This is not the panelists' fault. It's my fault. They've just got a lot of good things to say, and I don't want to cut them off because, I mean, this is a topic we could talk about forever. Probably have to do this 3 or 4 more times just to get through the myriad of questions that we could have for this. But we're going to move on and talk about accessibility to new players here in just a moment.